to everyone joining us from Japan, and good morning for those of you joining us from Stockholm and elsewhere in Europe. Welcome to the third event of the Europe-Asia webinar series, hosted jointly by the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies and the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm, Sweden. My name is Sam Barron. I'm a research fellow here at YCAPS and will be co-moderating today's discussion alongside my colleague, Dr. Jagannath Panda, the head of the Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs at ISDP. For today's webinar, we'll be hosting a roundtable to discuss the future of Korea's relationship with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Since 2005, South Korea has been an active partner of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Built on shared values, the Seoul-NATO partnership has quickly become a strong one, especially in the cyber domain. Recent months have also seen a growing chemistry between NATO and its partners in the Indo-Pacific, with the recent announcement that the organization would open its first representative office in Asia. In June 2022, the newly elected South Korean president, Yoon Suk-Yeol, participated in the NATO summit, even holding a meeting with US President Joe Biden, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, following their discussion to resume trilateral military exercises. For Yoon, the meeting with the country's European partners is a step forward in his quest to turn South Korea into a global pivotal state. He announced Seoul's decision to establish a diplomatic mission at NATO's Brussels headquarters, demonstrating his commitment to pursue a more institutionalized and consistent dialogue with the alliance. Although joining NATO as a member is not in the cards for the ROK, a robust defense partnership in the Indo-Pacific between the two partners across the globe can nevertheless be beneficial for both parties, with them supporting each other's capabilities, enhancing interoperability through regular military interactions, and other forms of cooperation for the maintenance of peace and security within the Indo-Pacific region. Against this backdrop, Korea's growing ties with NATO raise a number of critical questions, which we'll try to raise during this webinar. First, what does South Korea's strategic alignment with NATO mean for East Asian security? And what implications will South Korea's closer affinity with NATO mean for Korea-Japan relations? To help us gain a better understanding of Korea's expanding engagement with NATO, joining us this evening are Dr. Wool-Yeol Pike, Dr. Hoon-Ji Rim, and Mr. Ricardo Villa. Dr. Wool-Yeol Pike is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and International Studies, deputy director of the Yonsei Institute of North Korean Studies, and the director of the Center for International Relations at Yonsei University in Seoul, South Korea. Dr. Pike is also a visiting fellow at the Institut de Recherche Stratégique in France, and also an adjunct professor in Belgium. Dr. Hoon-Ji Rim is an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS and a non-resident scholar at SAIS's Edwin O. Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies. She writes extensively on extended deterrence, Indo-Pacific strategy, East Asian security dynamics, emerging technologies, and alliance politics. She has held research fellows with Tufts University and the Pacific Forum. Mr. Ricardo Villa is a project coordinator at the Institute for Security and Development Policy. He holds an MA in Global Peace, Security, and Strategic Studies from Aloysius College in Belgium, as well as a bachelor's degree in Cultures and Societies and Languages, specializing in India and Northeast Asia in Italy. His security policy background complements the research portfolio at ISDP, which includes peace theory, geopolitics, humanitarian and development assistance, as well as human trafficking issues across the globe. A quick reminder before I hand over the floor to Dr. Panda is that this event is on the record and is being recorded and will be uploaded to the official YCAPS YouTube channel. So please keep this in mind and please feel free to type any questions you may have for the speakers in the chat below. So with that, over to you, Jagannath.
Thank you, Sam, for that lovely introduction, and great pleasure to be among the best of the minds on the subject. And I think this is the third in series, as Sam pointed out. And at the outset, let me apologize on behalf of YCAPS and ISDP for a little delay in the project, because we thought it's at 11 o'clock, but some of you are waiting, but actually the time had changed. So we're happy to be back on this series. And as Sam mentioned, we are fortunate to have three excellent speakers on the subject who have followed the subject, who have worked on the subject. Dr. Wool-Yeol Pike, who is an associate professor with the Yonsei University. He has published a policy brief recently on the subject on South Korea and NATO. Second, we have Dr. Yoon Suk-Yeol. She's an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced Studies. She has very closely followed Korea's relations with the US and with the West. I've been fortunate to read some of her excellent write-ups. And my own colleague from ISDP, Mr. Ricardo Villa, who has been following the Korean issues and Asia's geopolitics, being in Europe, being in Sweden, which is the happening place, and given Swedish application to become a NATO membership. He has been following these issues very closely for some time. So therefore, we are fortunate to have three competent scholars on the subject who have followed this subject very closely. And let me share a little bit a background note, my intention. I'm currently visiting in The Hague in the Netherlands. And today morning, I just came back from a meeting with from the Dutch Foreign Ministry. I was talking to the newly appointed Dutch ambassador to Indo-Pacific and their Asia sections who are dealing with China, Japan, and Korea. One interesting observation, and I think each of these diplomats from the Dutch Foreign Ministry, they said that, all this while they have seen a lot of activism from Japan when it comes to the European politics, when it comes to the transnational politics. They have seen a lot of activism, of course, from China as the active and, as the revisionist power. They have seen also a kind of a much more proactive approach from India. But so far, all this year, what the Dutch Foreign Ministry actually said with me is that they didn't really see all this while, all these years, South Korea becoming an active player. Their observation has been that South Korea was more of a passive player in the European domain, acting on the limited field. And then Korea's engagement with the West, Korea's engagement with NATO and with the European politics was very limited. And there is a change happening, and that's a welcome change. And this was aptly noted by the Dutch Foreign Ministry and few colleagues, strategic thinkers whom I am meeting here. And that is a very welcome and positive change in the context when the current Yoon administration in South Korea is having a much more elaborative and focused Indo-Pacific strategy. So with that background note, let me pose those two very primary and basic questions in order to go into the details of the discussion. That what does really South Korea's strategic alignment with NATO means for the larger East Asian security, and also obviously for the Indo-Pacific security? And what implications will South Korea's closer affinity with NATO mean for Korea-Japan relations? Because this is one medium where probably after some kind of improvement we are noticing on Japan-South Korea relations, do you really think that South Korea becoming, aligning much and much closer to NATO, would really that help in terms of bridging the gap or building a confidence between Japan and South Korea? So with these two basic questions, I'll first welcome, Dr. Welpek to share his observation, and then I'll go for Dr. Reem and then Ricardo, my colleague from ISDP. So over to you. Well, maybe 5 to 7 minutes. Keep it brief, keep it pointed so that we can have more discussion. 5 to 7 minutes. If you want to go a little more also, you are welcome, but keep it brief. Over to you.
Oh, okay, thank you for a kind introduction and then, the suggesting those agendas. What does South Korea strategic alignment with NATO means for the East Asian security? And then the second question, what implications will South Korea's closer affinity with NATO mean for the Korea-Japan bilateral relationship? First thing, I need to talk about the most recent NATO foreign ministers meeting in Oslo. Focused on the three strategic subjects. Number one, NATO-Ukraine Commission, upgraded from NATO-Ukraine Council, launched in 1997. That is pretty obvious, for NATO to expand to the Ukraine in the, I think it's probably not a short term, but medium term. The second was the increase the budget, defense budget up to 2%, be confirmed and then reinforced. And then finally, deepening the relationship with AP4 Asia-Pacific partner of 4 countries, say Japan and Australia and New Zealand and Korea. Now NATO and the AP4 summit and then alignment has been institutionalized. The upcoming NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania next month will cement this type of institutionalization. In this context, we need to closely monitor how the East Asian and Oceanian countries perceive, respond, or read the alignment and cooperation with NATO as a collective, as well as NATO's individual countries. Let's take a quick look at the Korea case. Korea is looking to Europe and then moves to Europe in the military and strategic dimension, in addition to the already burgeoning and then maturing commercial industrial cooperation. And it wants to boost its ties with the NATO, even as strengthening relationship with AP4 one more time, formats. And then form an important aspect of NATO 2030 agenda. Korea has proactively joined this diplomatic effort, a foreign policy initiative that unprecedentedly bold for Korea, which has been passively stuck in Northeast Asia. As Jagan mentioned his conversation with the Dutch policymakers, foreign policymakers, and then it was pretty surprising for the European decision makers and strategic thinkers to see South Korea actually entering this European continent in many the strategic dimensions. And then this series of political action already bring South Korea multiple consequences, both positive and negative with its neighbors in domestic politics and then many things, and which only increase in the number and magnitude. And then the Korean perspective and conversion, for strengthening ties with NATO as the world experience a convergence of regions, and the Indo-Pacific region and the Euro-Atlantic region. The regional convergence is happening, and then the South Korea's looks and to move to the Europe and then to NATO, and that actually shows one example, very preliminary example for that. And then security dimensions, military, economy, technology, and political regime. And then, South Korea's, approach to Europe is not one, unidimensional monopoly. It's a multidimensional, economic at the same time, many things with, other, technological cooperation and economic cooperation, and even in environmental cooperation. They are talking about forests too. So this type of multi-dimensional the security also happening with South Korea's approaching to the NATO and then European countries. Against the big drop, and then South Korea needs NATO much more than before. Given the 4 key factors, the U.S. push to incorporate and utilize Korea's state capacity within Europe. And then number 2 is, South Korea's, their desperate need of capable, partner, especially in upper middle, powers, in Europe as well as in the Pacific region. I mean, Japan is the obvious, target, for South Korea right now, even in terms of the alignment with NATO, and then defense industrial opportunity, of course. I will briefly mention about the cooperation with Poland and other countries in the industrial, defense industrial sectors, and the nuclear tripwire between Ukraine and then Taiwan Strait and then Korean Peninsula and Japanese archipelago. This is another big the point for us to keep in mind. So the most likely vice versa, NATO gradually see this type of the consequences or say expectations from South Korea's deeper alignment or involvement in the European affairs and from the strategic and military point of view. And it means alignment direction is not just from the west to east, but also from the east to the west. It's only when we talk about those, the South Korea or other the East Asian or Oceanian countries' involvement in alignment with NATO and other countries, always west to east. But South Korea goes to Europe these days. has a, it's a different angle, but, China actually went to, Europe. And then Japan is already there too. So this type of, change of, the perception might be necessary, for understanding Korea's alignment with the NATO for the East Asian security. A clear evidence or experiment is happening between Korea and Poland, who started $6 billion USD worth of arms deal since last year. The Polish top leaders repeatedly label Korea as a new ally, and then the Korean decision makers echoing it. It was beyond the imagination, to overcome the tyranny of distance, 7,738 kilometers apart between Warsaw and Seoul before. And now it's really happening, and via through the defense industrial alignment, based upon economic cooperation and technology cooperation. If not alliance, its alignment is really happening across multi-dimensional security convergence. The second one, it's question is implication for the Japan-South Korea relationship, Korea-South Korea, the Korea-Japan relations. And then the recent reapproachment between Korea and Japan changed many strategic structures across Korean Peninsula, Northeast Asia, Indo-Pacific, and between Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic. Korea's closer affinity with NATO opens up another large space for these two countries outside or inside their own top. And the approachment vastly improved the bilateral relations across multi-dimensional security, military again. This economic security is a really big deal right now, and the technological security at the same time, so-called like-minded countries with political system and values. Nevertheless, Korea needs Japan to go to Europe together, and then receive or accept or deal with the NATO or European powers in Indo-Pacific region, along with the United States and Australia and New Zealand. The most recent Korea Pacific Island country summit a week before shows that Korea has been expanding its strategic horizon down to Oceania. In my view, Australia will be a pseudo ally, if not official ally, next 10 years or so. So this is really changing structural change for South Korea as well as Japan. So NATO can come to this region, and then South Korea and Japan go together with to Europe in a multi-dimensional security point of view. And then of course China and then Russia and North Korea. We don't need to discuss. We need to discuss about it, but I think it's but only one concern one more time: antagonizing Russia and then China at the same time, North Korea, and then problematic to form the really rigid and concrete two blocks led by the United States and China. This must be kept in mind, but I think it's South Korea and Japan has a good opportunity outside North Korea and then Northeast Asia. So go to another strategic space in Europe and then do something together. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are excellent observations. We will come back to you, Professor Welpeck, but let me go back to you, Yoon-Shin, maybe 5 to 7 minutes with your observation. How do you see the current developments between South Korea and NATO, particularly from the American point of view or from the transatlantic point of view?
Thank you. First, thank you for the invitation to this wonderful event with a fabulous topic and a hot topic too. So I want to start with how Japan's doing. I think Japan is doing great in terms of NATO-Japan cooperation. They just announced that Japan is going to host a NATO liaison office in Japan, which is a significant step forward for Japan and NATO cooperation. And I was glad to see that South Korea isn't too far behind. I went through their joint statement, and what interested me was that in addition to condemning Russia of its active war in Russia-Ukraine war and acknowledging the threat that North Korea is posing, these cooperation, the field of cooperations mentioned in the joint statements is very broad, but then they are also supported by some detailed practical steps. One of them, Jagana said you're in Hague right now. One of them is on responsible AI in military domain summit, hosted by both Dutch and South Korean government. And the second summit is to be hosted by the South Korean government. So this component of emerging technologies, especially AI, and I think there are several semiconductors and microelectronics. These are the very strategic sectors that is also related to traditional security, hard security, as well as economic security that Dr. Peck mentioned. And another thing is what was important, and I think it was very interesting, is that number 10 of the article number 10 mentions how it is important that Japan and South Korea cooperate for South Korea and NATO relations. So there's a component that everyone in Europe and South Korea realizes and recognizes the importance of Japan-South Korea cooperation going forward. So the implications for East Asian security, the NATO and South Korean alignment and its implications for East Asian security I would like to speak in terms of US-RK alliance perspective. I say there are 3 points. First, strengthened US alliance globally. So what does it mean? I think it means that under deepening strategic competition between US and China, one of the very important things the US is trying to do is get everyone to its side and strengthen what's already existing and going forward, make this networks of alliances and special strategic partners in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region. And what it's trying to do, in my opinion, is to reconceptualize and update its role in East Asia, which was providing security guarantee and extended deterrence, extended nuclear deterrence, through burden sharing and also contingency planning. And having NATO there in the Indo-Pacific theater is actually like a backup support for US-Japan, US-Korea alliance. So that's, I think, one of the things the US is going for. Second, further globalization of what used to be local, regional issues. So say, for example, North Korean nuclear issues. You can't say it's a local issue, but it was more confined to Indo-Pacific region. But now US-RK alliance has this opportunity to bring it to the international stage and cooperate with the NATO. And actually what it does is that it gives US-RK alliance more cards to play to put more pressure on North Korea and or further promote cooperation on the negotiation table regarding human rights issues, non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation, and also arms trade and so on. And of course, there could be a downside to it, more like a concern that you have to keep in the back of your head, is that the more stakeholders in the region may bring more complex security dynamic because everyone is pursuing their own strategic interest. So the dynamic will become more complex, and it could be a downside to it. And third, last but not least, so further invitation of NATO or European issues to East Asia. I think this is one of the points Dr. Peck also mentioned. This, in my opinion, may trigger like fear of entrapment for US allies in East Asia, Japan, and South Korea by being dragged into like conflicts elsewhere, say in Europe. However, this also for United States, like it's linked to the burden sharing and also having this network, support network. So at the end, I think there is this convergence of East Asian allies and European allies. And for this, I think there's a good chance for Japan and South Korean cooperation Because if you understand South Korea-Japan relationship, it's very complex. And the challenge, actually, the biggest challenge is the domestic politics and media play that actually triggers somewhat myopic policy decision makings and sometimes not very productive for either of the countries. But by bringing this Korea-Japan cooperation issue to the multilateral platform, this actually relieves some pressure for both countries and say for bilateral cooperation. So in a multilateral platform with other European countries, Japan and South Korea can naturally participate in European initiatives. And you don't have to even call it South Korea-Japan cooperation, but in reality, it is. So there is this practicality that both countries can benefit from without risking any domestic pressure, political pressure from home. And I think that's one of the biggest advantage for pursuing NATO cooperation with NATO for both Japan and South Korea. Another thing is that Dr. Beck also mentioned this, so I'm going to go quickly over this. There is a convergence in strategic interest. Japan is pursuing NATO cooperation with NATO based on its strategic interest calculation, and South Korea is doing so as well. The previous administration, I would say, was more concerned or more focused on dealing with North Korea, that it was so focused it couldn't see beyond the Korean Peninsula. But I think with this administration, like the President Yoon said, South Korea stepping up as a global pivotal power player. And I think that's what it exactly means, to go beyond the Korean Peninsula, to participate more actively in this network of cooperation and alliance. And within that, in that context, I think Japan and South Korea also can benefit from mutual cooperation. I'll end here. Thank you.
No, thank you. In fact, I do agree with you and Dr. Paik that there are more pressure emerging on North Korea, which is a welcome initiative. And also, Japan-South Korea relations improving, it will definitely influence the East Asian power politics accordingly. But what I would actually be interested more in terms of discussing during the Q&A is about how does it really impact the China's strategic planning in the East Asian regions. Maybe you and Dr. Paik could touch upon not only the China issue, but also the China-Russia chemistry. Russia has a very focused Northeast Asian focused foreign policy. Let's not really overlook that on the backdrop of Russia's war with Ukraine. Russia is a significant player in the Northeast Asian politics. In fact, what we saw during the previous Moon administration, when the new Northern policy and the new Southern policy was introduced, Russia was factored in the new Northern policy as a critical player in the region. So I think from South Koreans' point of view, how does really the China factor and the China-Russia chemistry in the regions really shape the East Asian politics? Probably would like to discuss a little bit, but we'll come back to both of you. Let me welcome now Ricardo, just to share the European perspective, or let's say the pan-European perspective. How does the South Korean and NATO alignment is posing for the European security in terms of more engagement in terms of our politics? How do you really see it? And what is Sweden's perspective? You could share some of your thoughts, that would be interesting. You are muted.
You're muted, Ricardo.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it working out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction to both Sam and Jagannath, and thank you for your presentation, Dr. Rim and Dr. Guyat. From a purely European, pan-European perspective, there's a couple of different views that I would offer to the panel. So obviously, the relationship between NATO and South Korea has to be seen, and obviously for NATO in general, the focus on the Asia-Pacific has to be seen in the context of the growing Sino-American competition. But also we have to see the general trends that NATO itself and European states have been noticing within East Asia, and especially within exchange of rhetoric. NATO has shown, especially with the visit from Jens Stoltenberg in January and February 2023, that NATO security and East Asia security are inextricable. They're extremely well connected. China is understood as a systemic threat, as a revisionist power to this whole world order, and then South Korea and Japan and other East Asian nations have been recognized as global hubs for security, for science and technology and military innovation, which is, at least in my perspective, one of the major focuses that we can see with NATO engagement with the East Asian nations and Indo-Pacific partners. The general perspective that I would offer here is that even though it would be easy to understand this shift within the context of US refocus onto Asia, of integrated deterrence, federating all your allies and your partners in East Asia, there is a lot more agency that has to be given to European nations and their East Asian partners. We are entering an extremely more multiple world. Nations will follow their interests, and they will try to address and meet China's challenge based on their own national interests. And this alignment between South Korea and European nations with East Asian nations is within this context. Europe in general, NATO in general, has been recognizing the threat that China poses to the international rules-based order, but there are obviously differences in the views, and we've seen that in the drafting of the strategic concept itself. The UK, together with the United States, for example, had a fiercer stance towards China and wanted to have a fiercer stance towards China, while you had Germany and France take a little bit less of an aggressive approach in this regard. On the specific side of cooperation, looking at practical cooperation from exercises perspective and military presence, it's from NATO perspective, it's difficult. It's not cost effective. The war in Ukraine has created a market gap and has stretched out a lot of European military hardware and commitments to devote NATO's further NATO's engagement militarily in the region would simply stretch out this to a point that probably would create cracks in the security architecture in Europe. And logistically, even for South Koreans, for example, it would be quite hard to join exercises on a constant, regular basis physically. We've seen South Korea's participating in cybersecurity exercises, but those have been mostly online. Therefore, those will be continued in a sense, but to expect a further NATO presence in the region is a bit complicated, I would say. Additionally, to trace back to what you were saying, Jagannath, to further NATO involvement in East Asia could create a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of entrenchments. I mean, we've seen the reactions from North Korea about the opening of the NATO office in Japan. We could expect a worse reaction from North Korea in a similar instance, and we could also see a definite pushback from the Chinese if this were to happen. And on the point that Dr. Rim was making, I would say this would increase complexity, yes, in part, but personally, I would see a more totalistic approach involving NATO as simplifying somehow the differences that we can see and we know exist between South, Southeast, and Northeast Asia, and East Asia in general, between all the nations that compose it. So having a totalistic approach would end up simplifying strategic solutions that would need to be tailored to strategic problems that arise specifically to the region and to the actors in there. And on a side note, on NATO's engagement and South Korea, I would say that for South Korea, this engagement with NATO will remain probably, and also for NATO, will remain probably mostly focused on non-traditional security issues. While non-traditional security issues, as Dr. Lim was saying, like supply chain for semiconductors and AI and big data and all of this are extremely important, and hard security. South Korea's involvement in this will probably remain within the non-traditional domain because we have a very strong, long-standing US-ROK alliance that has shaped the military engagement in the region and on the peninsula. This will not change. And for South Korea, this engagement, separating military, hard military, and non-traditional security issues is a safer option, I would say, than engaging directly with other regional organizations like the Quad Plus. This would offer South Korea a bit of a leeway to work around its hedging stance towards China. Regardless, this will not change. This will continue. South Korea is moving away from it, but it's doing so gradually. It cannot afford to do this abruptly. And entering Quad in this regard would sign a complete shift. NATO engagement and the maintenance of the alliance with the US would kind of maintain for South Korea this possibility of non-alignment in or well, strategic ambiguity, so to say. And on a specific front, that is going back to the market, to the European defense gap market that we're seeing now, I think this for NATO is a pretty interesting issue to look at, and that will be probably looked at. We could see the relationship between South Korea and NATO continue in the same direction as the Japanese one with NATO, with an ITPP, in a tailored partnership that will enhance the partnership at a comprehensive level, and would solve a lot of the problems that we're seeing now within the defense market. So the European defense market is seeing a gap in capabilities internally to European states. The large-scale lethal aid provided to Ukraine has created gaps for and needs and security needs for nations that needs to be addressed with a limited budget and within a limited time, which we've seen, for example, with Germans. It's not doable. It cannot be done. The defense market, defense contractors in Europe have had to go through decades of disarmament. The production in Europe of military hardware has decreased to a point where fast production is impossible. While South Korea can fill this gap, could act as a stopgap measure in this specific time and context, because we can see, at least from a NATO perspective and internally European perspective, there is a at least from my view, there is a lack of long-termism in arms procurement, which South Korea could fill, and obviously South Korea could then exploit for its own benefit and its defense experts in this regard. And lastly, more and more specifically to science and technology, tracing back to the idea of AI and semiconductors and emerging and disruptive technologies, we can see that South Korea could again act and provide a certain degree of support in this federation of like-minded allies, because at least from a European perspective, we can see that there is a change. Technological stake within, technological edge within NATO members and within European members states is at stake. We have seen a degradation of state-funded research over the past 50 years. South Korea has never stopped this. South Korea is one of the biggest investors, providing investors for R&D in this domain, and holds a hedge on multiple technologies, and is very well poised as well and it's very skillful in integrating all of these technologies, both at the military and at civilian level, which for NATO member states, it's become increasingly difficult. And this cooperation, in a sense, for NATO especially, and for European countries, through SPS program and all those science and technology programs within NATO, could be extremely useful in going forward in identifying all those technologies in advance and acquire them in advance, obviously, all those technologies that will impact military capabilities, will impact live combat, and then would offer a chance to integrate all of these capabilities within their commands, within their armies. I guess that's it. Well, thank you for the discussion.
No, thank you very much. Very useful observation, Ricardo. In fact, I do agree with you that NATO's involvement in East Asia are going to at least complicate the situation more, because there will be strong Chinese reactions coming up, and there might be also, we might expect worse reactions from North Korea in terms of military and nuclear behavior. I do agree with you. But again, taking that point ahead, and therefore, before we go to the Q&A, and I request Sam to read those questions, one point I would like to specifically invite your observation before we open the floor for discussion. One is that if we see NATO's increasing alignment with South Korea, it could be seen more as a positive development as far as the American treaty alliance politics is concerned, as Yoon Suk-Yeol was mentioning. It could also be seen much more negatively, as Ricardo pointed out, strong reactions from China and also from North Korea. So therefore, and also what Will was pointing out about the science and technology, and about specific the other nitty-gritties when it comes to the alignment politics in the regions. If we take into consideration, my pointed questions to all of you would be, what kind of reactions, specific reactions we might see from China? Because China is already having a treaty alliance, kind of treaty with North Korea for so many years. And that treaty is getting renewal in every 20 years. And I think even though, before the pandemic, many observers tried to write down that China-North Korea alliance treaty by saying that, it doesn't really hold much ground in today's politics. But today, after the Ukraine war, I think China-North Korea treaty alliance has become much more urgent, much more important, to the fact that when NATO is having a closer alignment with South Korea and Japan. So what would your take on this, particularly if we take the China-North Korea treaty into account? How do you see this treaty evolving further or strengthening the China-North Korean alliance after the South Korea, NATO kind of closer alignment? What would be the fallout from this perspective? The second point I would invite your comments is that, how do you really see China, Russia, North Korea trilateral, or let's say Russia coming into, taking much more deliberative interest in the East Asian politics? How do you see that unfolding at a time, let's say, 1 year after the Ukraine war, or a couple of years after the Ukraine war, the war might eventually be stopped? How do you see Russia coming into the region and posing itself as a power? Or the China-Russia North Korea trilateral politics emerging from here on? Maybe first I would go with Woo-Hel and then Yeon-chi and then Ricardo. How do you see the China's perspective role in terms of alliance exercises with North Korea, and then China, Russia, and North Korea trilateral, or the politics there? Over to you, Woo-Hel.
Okay. Of course, China doesn't welcome this structural change in Europe and Indo-Pacific region. NATO's involvement, and then or the other way around, Korea's approach to Europe and NATO. It's not a welcoming change for China. But it concerns more NATO's involvement in Indo-Pacific region so far, not the other way around. China, of course, is very feel uncomfortable, from South Korea to go and involve and then engage with the NATO country in the Europe or Euro-Atlantic region. But more immediate concern for China is the NATO's involvement in the Pacific region. To be honest with you, but the NATO countries, aside from the United States and might be Canada, which is pushing North Pacific alliance these days, have a limited military capacity to engage in this region. This region is Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and then Korean Peninsula, and even South Pacific, where the France has its own dominion territory. So it's a one or two frigates, aircraft carrier, Charles de Gaulle every other year in this region do not threaten China at all. France, a champion of a European strategic autonomy from the United States, makes a clear remark that the Indo-Pacific region, even though they want to engage, but they are not NATO especially is not the player in the in the Indo-Pacific region. So more concerns comes from vocal resistance from NATO leader that alerts European, East Asian, and Oceanian and other regions strategists, as well as the multi-dimensional security convergence. Say military, technology, and then economy all combined to constrain China across the globe. So China sees, in my view, it's this type of NATO, South Korea, NATO AP4 closer relationship. It's not just the impact on the immediate neighboring marine security. It's just go all over the world. That's why they are concerned about this NATO AP4, NATO South Korea, NATO Japan, NATO Australian cooperation. The China sees of course the long-term consequences, and then they have a very very good and very effective long-term strategy from the very beginning. Their strategic horizon time frame is not just 5 or 10, 15 years. They just go 40, 50 years. So they seize it. China knows the real struggle for the survival, and then dominance comes as soon as the Russian-Ukraine war ends. We do not know when it ends. But united fronts, that's the best strategy of the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, and between NATO and AP4 bothers them quite a bit. And then you mentioned about Russia. Russia, South Korea it's had a very good relationship, very good relationship with Russia before. But now, Russia actually openly, labels South Korea as an enemy. It was pretty shocking, to South Korea. But this NATO engagement by South Korea, at the same time, most of all the defense industrial cooperation with Poland and the Central, Eastern, and the Northern European countries has changed quite a bit of bilateral strategic relations between Russia and Korea. So what is South Korea doing is just rearming those countries, which has a very tense and then a hostile relationship with Russia at this moment, and this is not a good sign for Russia. But Russia has a very limited state capacity in the Northeast Asia. Of course, Russia can do a lot of things in the Korean Peninsula, aligning or supporting North Korea and then China, and then Dr. Panda actually mentioned about this trilateral military or strategic alignment. It's not alliance, of course. Korea, North Korea, and then China is a treaty aligned, but Russia is not. But this type of thing, I think it's a little bit of a stretch so far. These trilateral cooperation and alignment, it's not very possible, at least until the end of Russian and the Ukraine war. And Russia will have a very hard time to regain its state capacity after war, if it's really possible, to impose its will and then capacity in the Korean Peninsula or Northeast Asia. China knows it, and then North Korea is very well aware of it. So Russia is more nominal, partner for the alignment in Northeast Asia. Now focus is on European, Ukraine, front line.
Sure, thank you, Yoon Suk.
Yes. So when the Quad was first launched, Chinese initial response was, oh, it's going to be an East Asian version of NATO. And China vehemently opposed to the idea. Same with Japan, South Korea's cooperation with NATO. I think China feels more this type of effort is a US strategy to contain China further. In this context, I think China, North Korea alliance or cooperation, I don't think it's going to go farther. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference, because I think North Korea is taking advantage of China. It's strategically using China and its relationship with China to stay in the international political scene. North Korea is a burden, to be honest. The issue has not been solved. China, I think, prefers status quo when it comes to the Korean Peninsula, but North Korea is not, doesn't want that. So it's actually becoming more of a burden and challenge for China to carry North Korea. But again, China is also taking advantage of the situation to put more pressure on the United States. Unlike many think, North Korea does not like China. I think that's also an issue. They never liked China. So that's a more fundamental issue there. When it comes to Sino-Russia cooperation or the trilateral cooperation, I think that poses more threat to South Korea and Japan. I guess in order to understand the dynamic, I think you need to understand Russia. To be honest, I think Russia, is confused. Itself is confused that it doesn't know if it's an East Asian country or European country. So it wants to stay relevant by showing off its military arms and linking itself to China. And that's how it stays afloat. Of course, this poses more challenges to the United States, because the US has never dealt with two great powers as an adversary. The Cold War era, it was just Soviet Union, but now it has to deal with China and Russia. And imagine if they cooperate. I'm not going to say cooperate, but cooperate. It's going to pose more challenges. On that note, I think 2019, there was a coordinated effort between China and Russia to fly over the Korean air defense zone. The fact that it was coordinated between China and Russia was very alarming to the US-RK alliance. We were not expecting it. We were not prepared for it. Another thing is, even though it is the China-Russia cooperation is a concern for the United States and the US-RK alliance, the good news is that their strategic interest does not align. So it's my understanding that China's perception of alliance is very different from US alliance. China does not believe in alliance, the US concept of alliance. Say like US-RK alliance, China would see, why would you cooperate or strategically partner with a lesser, smaller power. So that's like a Chinese mentality there. And same with Russia. Russia is an old, foregone power. Why would you treat Russia as equal? So there is this different concept of alliance for China, and Russia as well. It has its pride, and it's after more practical gains than Chinese strategic gains that Jagannath mentioned. So there is a not perfectly aligned strategic interest there that we, US alliance, can actually benefit from. And the trilateral cooperation, unless North Korea changes somehow, I don't think there is going to be any trilateral cooperation. Rather, I think the China, who's threatened by this containment, who thinks it's a containment strategy of the United States, will actually pursue like BRICS cooperation so that it can go beyond this containment. The strategy of pearl strings, so that it cooperates more. Brazil, India, as we saw, and it wants to strengthen this anti-hegemonic alignment rather than stay with Russia and North Korea within the region and pursue further cooperation. I think that's what China is trying to do these days. Yeah.
Interesting observation, Ricardo.
I mean, I do not have much to add to this. They have made excellent points with which I do agree. On a note on what Dr. Lim was saying on the idea that the Chinese don't see the concept of alliance as the US does, it's fairly evident also in how they shape the idea of Sino-American strategic competition. The Chinese in this case tend to have a self-perception that puts them under the US on an hegemonic scale, in a sense, where they don't see themselves as being on par with the United States, so they don't understand and they do not see this concept of hegemonic competition with the US because China is not there yet. While in the United States and South Korea and Japan, China is there yet in and of itself. On China and North Korea, yes, the relationship is a liability for China. North Korea is very practical in its approach to pretty much anything that they do and that they approach. China has been instrumental to surviving the last 2-3 years of closing down, and North Korea will continue to do so and will continue to kind of walk on the edge, in a sense, in its relationship with China, and this will not really change. Also, because we cannot really expect North Korea to change soon. On the Russia front, I would say that cooperation and collaboration with the Russians will become more and more challenging going forward. There is a difference in how China and Russia see the international system. China's always benefited from it and can still benefit from it and feels like it can continuously benefit from it by tailoring its approach, by going towards a collaboration with the BRICS, for example. Well, Russia reached a point, in a sense, where the system was not useful to Moscow at all, and I mean part of the aggression on Ukraine could be seen also in this kind of context where Russia is trying to break the system a little bit and create a wedge for itself and show force, and this for China has only given net minuses overall. And trilateral cooperation just falls into all of this. There's not really a possibility for deeper collaboration in the region because of asymmetric economic power and military power differences between the three actors, and also again, China's foreign policy is global, is not regional, regionally focused alone anymore. It cannot constrain itself in this quagmire that could be Northeast Asia in the future.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Those are excellent points from all three of you. In fact, I do agree with you on a couple of points. One is that probably we might not really see a serious progress happening between China, Russia, and North Korea at this moment, as far as forming a credible trilateral alliance is concerned, because of the obvious reasons. One is that the way China treats the alliance politics, more hierarchical in nature. Second, the kind of perceptual difference are there, particularly on the North Korean issues, as far as China and Russia is concerned. And also, I think North Korea's confidence in the Chinese decision-making process and Russian decision-making process is still not there. North Korea is not there as a confident, power, as a partner. And I think that lack of confidence will really deter this trilateral to emerge, clearly. But at the same time, we should not really overlook the history. I was reading a couple of literatures. The history suggests that there was transfer of technology between North Korea, Russia, China, Pakistan, and Iran. It has happened 3 decades back, 4 decades back. So why it can't happen tomorrow? Why they might not really go for an AUKUS-like alliance, what we are seeing in the Indo-Pacific. Possibility might be low at this moment, but given the kind of politics emerging and when there is no end to the Ukraine war, there is a possibility that some kind of broader regional agreement might happen among these 3 countries, or involving Iran or Pakistan. So there is always a possibility. We might not really outright rule it out, but I do agree with you. I think all of these fundamental differences among these 3 actors might really be the main barriers. But with this note, let me invite our audiences. If they have any specific questions, please feel free to ask in the chat box, in the Q&A box, so that we can read the question or invite you. But I would invite maybe Sam to make a few observations and read the questions and take the floor from here on. Sam, over to you.
Yep. Thank you so much, Jagannath, and thank you to all of our speakers for the really excellent insights they provided on this topic. So we've got a few questions in the chat. I have a question of my own I'll save for the end, but I just want to start with this first one from Rob Mason. He says, thank you for engaging with such an interesting topic, but has it occurred to anyone that NATO expansion may not actually be a good thing? How about reconceptualizing and updating the Indo-Pacific strategy in a form that is not confounded on a de facto division between powers? And so I think he's basically, making the point that, what is your response to the fact that, maybe NATO expansion in East Asia isn't a good thing? And kind of what is your response to that? Dr. Pike, I guess we'll start with you.
Well, I think it's a difficult question, to be honest with you. NATO coming in the Indo-Pacific region, or say South China Sea and Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula, of course, that's significantly raised the degree of conflict and struggle. I think this is a real fact. But again, as I told you before, it's it is coming, but at the same time, it takes quite a long time, for the NATO, again, aside from the United States and Canada, come to this region as a real, player to constrain or contain, China in the military and strategic sense. The other front line is more important. For example, Dr. Panda mentioned about Iran and Pakistan, and then there's closer to the European countries, Middle East and then North Africa, and then the Eastern Europe, and then Caucasus, and then these regions are more important for the NATO, and then more NATO can project their powers to these regions, which are commonly important for the China's growing power and then power projection in the future. So in this sense, it's not worrisome so far, to be honest with you. Another dimension is this is more like structural change, across the globe, the convergence among regions between especially these Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic regions. It's not just military dimension, but also economic and the technological security dimension. They are all intermingled and entangled. So it's if we do not we do not want to see this type of NATO's engagement in East Asia or Oceania, Indo-Pacific, but that's not very possible. Because again, South Korea and Japan and even China is go to the Europe and the Euro-Atlantic region too. So it is not very reasonable for us to just say stop the converging process among these regions, and then we'll see of course it's behind the United States behind it, but China actually initiated, and then Russia is doing it. And India doesn't like this type of convergence, but it's on the track, and it's via Quad and then other engagement. India is also in the South Pacific right now, so it's all engaging. So worrisome for us to witness this formation of the U.S. versus China red bloc, but it's really happening. So need to deal with it in not only in the Pacific but also Euro-Atlantic region.
Thank you, Dr. Pike. Dr. Rim, do you want to come in?
Yes, I understand what you mean by NATO expansion, but I would like to go over that term again, because that's what Chinese use, NATO, expansion of NATO, or Russians use expansion of NATO. But what it really is, I think, is a convergence of alliances from different theaters. So it's not just expansion of NATO. Well, if you are going to call it expansion of NATO, then we should also call it the expansion of East Asian alliance. So in this evolving security settings, I think the bilateral alliance, US alliance in East Asia, they're going to be playing an updated, bigger role. And also NATO is going to be playing an upgraded role. So it's not just an expansion of NATO, but it's more like everyone doing more work, coming closer together rather than just one rising.
Thank you, Dr. Rim. And Ricardo, any last thoughts on this point?
I do agree with Dr. Rim in this case. I mean, we can see that so far at the end of the day, the collaboration between NATO and East Asian partners is on science and technology mostly, and in collaborative military exchanges and in general, not really hard security or territorial expansion issues. And I wouldn't see the interest from NATO to go beyond this again because of logistical and non-cost effective issues and measures that have to be taken. While I do agree that the de facto division between two great powers is conceptually very, very entrenching, I do not see a possibility at the end of the day for NATO to go beyond this. The fact that NATO in itself is still NATO-led, and it still is used a lot of times as a framework for furthering sometimes U.S. interests, and this is part of this expansion, if you want to call it that, but mostly a general collaboration, I would say.
Thanks, Ricardo. I want to move on to the next question in the chat from Christoph Waldersee, who says, thank you all for your great inputs. I would be very much in favor of seeing closer cooperation between established democracies from all over the world so we can defend the rules-based order. Of course, countries like China and Russia won't wait for it to happen, but we can see that some of these member countries in Europe may not be supportive to cooperate with or even include members from Asia. So what would be the reply or the response from South Korea, Japan, and India to convince countries like France or others in Europe to agree to a new policy of a wider or broader NATO? Any initial thoughts, Dr. Pike? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think again, I think I mentioned about it, the one country, especially France. Now I see France, pushes back against the proposal for the NATO office in Japan, and then some other countries might be really concerned about the NATO's involvement in the Indo-Pacific region, along with Korea and and then Japan, but I think it's a general consensus among NATO is if they can deal with Russia, and then if they have some leftover to go beyond the Ukraine front line and Europe, then Indo-Pacific is the must region to say engage or say protect or something like that. So there is a consensus among NATO countries as far as I'm concerned. But it's France and then some other countries, very few countries, a minor number of countries are concerned about it. Probably Turkey will emerge as a player, for the the constraining NATO and the Indo-Pacific region 84 countries convergences. But Turkey and has a very complicated payoff structure for their own strategy right now. So okay.
Thank you, Dr. Pike. Dr. Rim?
Yes, I do agree with Dr. Beck that NATO, if they want to deal with Russia, of course, you have to cooperate with countries in Indo-Pacific region. But more so, I think I know how pressing the Russia-Ukraine war issue is in Europe, but also from East Asian perspective, what's more important or what's more long-term strategic concern is US-China strategic competition. And this also concerns European countries as well, because once this war, the Russian-Ukraine war is over, then the next big thing will be China. In that context, I think what European countries and East Asian countries and US, they all have to have some type of an agreed strategic interest aligned. And one of the things that I think they're already trying to do is deny China of an effective coercive means that it can use. And throughout Chinese strategy these days of becoming the world-class military or having like a high-tech edge, and also this military civilian fusion development strategy, and the core is the emerging technologies. So what the alliance is the US allies are trying to do is take that away. And I think it's already underway as in